The 2008 election was historic, with youth vote turnout skyrocketing from elections in the past. From earlier in the campaign, 2008 was proclaimed the year of the youth vote by everyone from MTV to Time magazine. On November 4th, they lived up to their billing. But what motivated these young citizens to become politically involved? Eagle Eye View's Nancy Andrade sat down for some answers and some insights with Dan Schnur, a former Republican political strategist and current director of the Unruh Institute and a professor at USC. Schnur has studied very closely the motivations and voting patterns of young people, and that was the subject of Nancy's discussion.
The reasons young people became so active in this year's politics, according to Dan Schnur, are many. But what was remarkable wasn't just the numbers of young people who turned out.
Well, I think what was interesting about this election, particularly as it related to young voters, is the overall number of young voters didn't increase that much, really by only a 1% margin over what we saw in the 2004 campaign. But the level of energy and the level of enthusiasm and the level of motivation on the part of young voters was something we haven't seen in this country for many, many years. So the real breakthrough to me wasn't necessarily in terms of numbers, but in terms of the intensity of the involvement.
Schnur says there wasn't any great change within the groups of young people who voted. In fact, the work that his institution, the Unruh Center, and other groups that work to get young people involved in politics was pretty much the same as other elections. It had to do instead with who was running.
And so while I'd like to take credit for the level of motivation and interest that students showed in the campaign this year, it didn't have much to do with me at all. It was about what Barack Obama and John McCain were doing out on the campaign trail. So what we tried to do here was not so much to provoke that interest, but rather to provide a channel for it. And we put together forums and panels and other types of events that allowed the students to listen and discuss what was going on the campaign trail. But it was the candidates themselves that motivated them, not anything we did here at the Institute.
The obvious question, of course, is, if both candidates did so much to motivate and attract young voters, why did one stand out more? Obama got 66% to McCain's 31% among younger voters. These numbers would suggest that despite the Obama win, there was a loss of interest in the Republican Party as well among young voters. However, Schnur argues that it was the numerous disadvantages that McCain had to work with that resulted in the Obama win.
I think it would have been very difficult for John McCain to be elected president this year under almost any circumstances. He is carrying the baggage of an unpopular war, a difficult recession, and of course a very unpopular president and administration. All that said, on the evening of September 14th, McCain was running relatively even in the polls with Senator Obama. And what happened on September 15th? Well, on September 15th, Wall Street collapsed, and it collapsed right on top of John McCain. And I think at that point, particularly for the blue-collar, working-class, culturally conservative voters, the so-called NASCAR moms and dads, who McCain needed to win, decided that instead of voting on cultural and social issues, decided that the state of the economy was such that they really were much more receptive to the message of change they were hearing from Senator Obama. So I think the election would have been a very difficult one for McCain under any circumstances. But once Wall Street collapsed, I don't think there was anything he could have done to change the outcome.
Perhaps the baggage that McCain had to carry was in fact what led to his defeat. But what about the level to which each candidate reached out to the younger voters? Candidate Barack Obama seemed to use technology as a great tool to collaborate with and include youth in his campaign. Schnur believes that perhaps the Republicans can learn from that tactic next time around.
One of the lessons that Republicans need to learn from what the Obama campaign did this year is harnessing the power of communications technology and taking the private sector marketing applications of that technology and applying it to the political sphere. I have a theory, I call it the politics of hunger. And the politics of hunger suggests that the longer it's been since you or your party's been invited to a White House state dinner, the hungrier you get, and the more creative you get, and the more innovative you get. Just as President Roosevelt pioneered the use of radio and President Kennedy pioneered the use of television, skills that they learned during Republican administrations that preceded their own terms in office. And just as Republicans became very talented at using direct mail, cable television, and talk radio during the Carter and Clinton administrations, Democrats have had 8 years to really hone their use of communications technology. I suspect that now that Republicans are outside the White House gates wondering what's being served at those state dinners, they're going to get a little bit more creative and innovative with the technology too.
And speaking of technology, social networks like MySpace and Facebook are also generally believed to have played a major role in drawing young voters' attention to the elections. Dan Schnur says that social networking provided a forum in which voters were no longer just a passive audience.
This is the first generation in history that's been able to talk back to politicians. Up until now, for 200 plus years in this country and for thousands of years, throughout world history, politicians talk and voters listen. It's a one-way conversation. And thanks to the power of technology, and in particular to the power of social networking, you are the first generation ever that can not only talk back to the candidates and talk back to the news anchors, but more importantly, talk to each other. And to me, more than anything that Barack Obama or John McCain or Ron Paul or Hillary Clinton or anyone else did in this campaign, to me the real story of youth involvement is that technology allowed this youngest generation not just to be a passive audience, the way voters have been for years and years and years, but to be a very vital part of the conversation. That is a transformative aspect in politics. It's tremendously empowering. It's one that this youngest generation of voters is taking for granted. It's one that the rest of our generations, like mine, are still figuring out.
As we have so far seen, one of Barack Obama's greatest strengths was his ability to interact with younger voters through the use of communications technologies. According to Dan Schnur, McCain's strengths when it comes to appealing to younger voters lies elsewhere.
I think one of the things that I've seen in the past that John McCain did very effectively to appeal to young voters was talk about the importance of national service, of community and civic involvement. I think one of the real unfortunate aspects of this campaign is he didn't spend as much time talking about those issues for understandable reasons, but I think it greatly impeded his ability to reach out to young voters in a way that he had in previous years.
This year's elections were different in many ways. Not only were the candidates using different strategies to reach the youth, but the issues being discussed were different as well.
There's any number of issues that motivated young people to turn out and vote. But my own opinion, for what it's worth, is that even though the economy became the overriding issue in this campaign for most voters, the things that originally drew young voters and their interest into this campaign, issues relating to the environment and global warming, issues relating to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and the broader war on terror, even while those issues subsided in terms of general public interest, I still think by Election Day those were the things that really motivated young voters even more than economic issues.
Although the Republican Party touched on all these issues throughout their campaign, their efforts were unsuccessful. Schnur believes their defeat was obvious and inevitable.
I think a lot of the reasons for the outcome of this election, I think, had more to do with the unpopularity of the current administration than anything else. That said, there's no question that Senator Obama was a remarkable and a unique candidate in all sorts of ways. So for John McCain, a lot of the baggage created by George Bush and the current administration were prohibitive, but you'd be giving Senator Obama short shrift if you didn't recognize the extraordinary campaign that he ran.
Schnur continues to emphasize the importance of communications technology and the way in which it is slowly but surely becoming an indispensable tool for future elections.
The advances in communications technology and social networking have empowered this youngest generation of voters in a way that no generation of voters in this country have ever been before. As we talked about earlier, these young voters can talk back to power, talk back to the candidates, talk back to the anchor people, but more importantly, it allows you, of course, to talk to each other. And the kind of coalitions that can spring up across party lines, across traditional ideological divides, is something we've never seen in politics before. I look, for example, at the coalition that has come together on behalf of more aggressive action in Darfur. You see very committed liberals, you see evangelical Christians working together across a partisan divide on issues that unite them. And that's not the kind of thing that could have happened without this technology. It's a remarkable breakthrough, and it's going to change politics forever. To me, it's by far the most important aspect of this election.
From USC, I'm Nancy Andrade for Eagle Eye Views, the 2008 election. Youth votes on the future. Back to you in the studio.